Stanford University.
The Human Experience. Inside the Humanities at Stanford University. humanexperience.stanford.edu.
So tonight, we're going to talk politics. And, of course, at Litquake, because it's a literary festival, we like to say that words really matter. Well, they certainly matter in politics, and especially in this 2012, this election year. And I think that, we had the presidential debate last week, certainly proved that to a certain extent. But I want you to chew on a couple of things I was thinking about with regard to tonight. So, for example, it's no longer called the Affordable Health Care Act. Instead, it is called Obamacare. And did you know that America no longer has rich people? They're now called job creators. So, of course, these are, phrases created by politicians and their operatives that try to make us think a certain way and possibly vote a certain way. And some of them, I think, it's interesting that some of them really stick. I think Obamacare has stuck to the point where the president himself is embracing it to a certain extent and using it as, yes, Obamacares. Job creators, I'm not so sure that's going to have lasting power, but you can see that a real effort has been made to put that into our consciousness. And of course, 2012 is not the first time this has happened. Historically, this is the way it's worked in politics in America for a very long time. We're going to hear about that today, not just what's happening now, but what has happened in the past. And I think a lot of you, like me, are thinking, well, I am totally too smart and too sophisticated to be manipulated like that. But I think we're going to hear that may not be the case from our panel of experts tonight. To my immediate right is Brandy Wilkins-Catanese, who's an associate professor of theater, dance, and performance studies and African American studies at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on African American performance and culture, spanning theater, film, television, visual arts, and politics. Next to her is Stanford associate English professor Paula Moya, who's the editor of Doing Race, 21 Essays for the 21st Century. Her research interests lie chiefly in the areas of 20th and 21st century American literatures, Chicana cultural studies, and feminist theory. And finally, at the end, we have Vaughn Raspberry, an assistant professor of English at Stanford University, and his current book project challenges the notion that landmark civil rights initiatives emancipated African American writers from the constraints of writing. So we're going to start by having each of our panelists here just tell us a little bit of their take on language and politics and the discourse of our times. I'm going to start with Brandy.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, and thank you all for being here. So I wanted to speak to two examples of ways that I see language and politics working together. And the first comes from a play by David Mamet. And it's a play that's title is a 4-letter word in every sense of that. Does anybody know what that word is? Race. That's right. Race, a word that supposedly, with the election of Barack Obama, was sort of handily meant to be erased from the national vocabulary, national conversations about identity, national character, individual and group belonging. And yet, less than 12 months after Obama takes office, this play, titled Race, premieres on Broadway. And I just wanted to start by actually reading the first scene, not even the entire first scene, but the opening moments. So Race is a play that is set in a law office. So we have three attorneys and a man who is in need of legal counsel, a black attorney who is a man, a white attorney who is a man. Together they founded a firm. A white man who comes in needing their services, and a young black woman who is a junior associate at the firm. Did anybody happen to see this play when it performed at ACT here in San Francisco? All right. That makes two of us. Good enough. So you will have to not hold against me the fact that I won't perform this as well as the people did at ACT. But scene 1, an office. Jack, Henry, Charles, and Susan on stage. And they are the entire cast. Henry, African-American attorney, sit down. Charles, the white man who is needing counsel, holds an overcoat, which Susan, the young black woman, takes from him. Charles sits. Henry continues. You want to tell me about black folks? I'll help you. O.J. was guilty. Rodney King was in the wrong place, but the police have the right to use force. Malcolm X was noble when he renounced violence. Prior to that, he was misguided. Dr. King was, of course, a saint. He was killed by a jealous husband, and you had a maid when you were young who was better to you than your mother. She raised you. You've never fucked a black girl, but one sat near you in science class, and she was actually rather shy. Pause. Charles, I would never say any of... Henry interrupts. You're fucking A right you wouldn't, which is the purpose of the lesson. Do you know what you can say to a black man on the subject of race? Charles, nothing. Henry, that is correct. Pause. Charles, black people can talk about race. Henry, how about that? So, this is how David Mamet ushers us into the world of this play, setting up some rules that he then goes on to mess with. But he lets us know right off the bat that we're dealing with an incendiary topic that has rules built into it, which gets us to thinking about language as a system of communication that has rules embedded within it, right? So, race goes on to talk about 2 issues simultaneously. One is whether or not the white man who has come looking for legal counsel has in fact committed the crime of which he is accused, which is raping a black woman. And he is emphatic in asserting his innocence, and their job is to figure out how to mount a vigorous defense of their client, regardless of the truth, which they don't really want to know in typical defense fashion. And the second story is about race as it plays out amongst these attorneys. So you have a black man and a white man who are, nervous and trying to figure out, or I shouldn't say nervous, but who are working to figure out what their strategy, because this is an incendiary situation, a white man being accused of raping a black woman, what their strategy is going to be, how they're going to manage the race card in that situation, and how their young black female associate is going to factor into that work in terms of being an ally for them as attorneys or having some sense of allegiance to the alleged victim of the crime. How's that going to play out? Is she going to be racially savvy enough to allow herself to be exploited for purposes of jury staging and politics, and yet post-racial enough to disavow any sort of affinity with a woman who is going to be, per strategy, criticized, have her sexual history brought into, question. People are going to be looking for ways to figure out if she's been asking for, whatever situation she found herself within. And so the way things play out, she is under suspicion for multiple reasons over the course of the play, and I won't ruin the ending for you by telling you what happens, but it's an interesting read, it's an interesting view, and it has performed very, very successfully across the country. It was on Broadway, it was here at ACT, it's performed at a lot of regional theaters, and it's gotten a lot of attention in the media. So I just wanted to share a couple of the excerpts of reviews that were featured on the back of the mass paperback. Ben Brantley of the New York Times, Scalpel-Edged Intelligence, Race is an Examination of Cultural Conscience and Paranoia, and a Topical Detective Story. Chris Jones, Chicago Tribune, Intellectually Salacious. Deep in its gut, Mamet's gripping play argues everything in America is still about race. John Simon of the Bloomberg News, a high-voltage melodrama, Race is unafraid to raise painful questions while dispensing prickly ideas and provocative dialogue amid steady suspense. Mamet adroitly mixes comic darts with tragic arrows, and the play is full of wry jokes, epigrammatic jolts, and acrid, cheeky provocations. So, the question, why do I want to talk about David Mamet's play at a panel that is meant to address the intersections of language, politics, discourse, and power? What does this have to tell us that could be useful to the things that we want to think through collectively this evening? So to answer that question, I want to sort of work backwards through those terms. First, thinking about power, right? That's fairly, I shouldn't say it's easy, but a definition that one wouldn't have to venture far to find is, sort of ability to exert influence or force that others have no choice but to respond to, individuals, entities, etc. Discourse, a way of thinking about the sort of parameters that get set around what we know and how we communicate that to one another. Language, and I'm sort of going to go out of order with this one. Language, systems of communication, as I said before, they conform to certain conventions. And you need to understand them in order to be able to participate. But then the last one, politics. This is, for me, the funny one, because it points to some of the things that I see playing out so specifically when we talk about race. When you do your lazy search for the definition of politics, you find yourself at the beginning of a circle. What is politics? The act of being political. Participating in political activity. What is political? Political is having to do with politics, right? So no one wants to define politics or what is political. And I think that this is one of the reasons why race functions as such a flashpoint in our society. We understand that it's political, but we don't have a lot of ways to be precise about what it means to think of race as having an enduring political import or power. And so in order to understand how that works, I want to bring race as an example of someone or a play by an author who insists on keeping that term alive and seeing what it can do in conversation with a more mundane example. And to do that, I want to think toward the Summer Olympics, which I hope some people in the room enjoyed. I did. And one of the most noteworthy things for Team USA was the history made in gymnastics, right? The women's team getting the gold medal after having gone through a little bit of a dry spell, returning to dominance of the international gymnastics scene. And the parallel story of Gabby Douglas, who was the first African-American female to score an individual all-around medal. And Gabrielle, I think people say that she prefers to be called Gabrielle than Gabby, became another node in this conversation about, language and politics, when language is thrust into political contexts and when people attempt to extract it from political contexts, when the word race has punch, when the term African American has punch, when it doesn't. When Bob Costas presided over NBC's coverage of the Olympics, there was a moment in which he spoke about Gabby Douglas, the history-making nature of her medal, and he acknowledged her race in doing so. And when he did that, everybody sort of pounced on him. And so I just wanted to share an example of how that discourse of power, the power to play the race card or not, manifested. People got very frustrated with the fact that Costas invoked race, even though he was doing it in a very soft way. Like, yes, this is going to be very inspiring for little black girls, but, let's not take that too far in saying that it needs to be inspiring for them because things are so bad for black people. It was a sort of milquetoast invocation of race. And yet, on Twitter, everybody went wild. And things were said such as, I hadn't once thought of Gabby Douglas being a black gymnast until Bob Costas just said it. You're better than that, Bob. Okay. That's going to be.
Okay. So I think I very much appreciated your opening sort of talk here, and I think in some ways I'm going to pick up on something that you opened up for us, which is the rules involved in talking about race. So In his 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, George Orwell considers language as, quote, an instrument for expressing and not for concealing or preventing thought. Now, in that essay, and I imagine a number of you may have read it, he lays out a program for curing what he calls the decadence into which the English language has fallen. And it is really a program that should be rightly required of every journalist working today, and certainly as a professor, I will say this, of every undergraduate and graduate student who's writing papers for my class. It's a very good, it's often taught in composition classes, and it works well in that way. Now, in the course of the essay, Orwell gives a lot of good examples of bad writing, and he makes several sagacious observations, among which are that if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought, and that in our time, of course he's writing in 1946, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Now, he explains his this last by writing things like the continuance of British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bomb on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face and which do not square with the professed aims of the political parties. And it's this last business of defending the indefensible and that that language is often used. Well, he says it is for this reason that such actions, right, dropping the atom bomb on Japan or the continuance of British rule in India, these actions were described and defended in language that was deliberately euphemistic, abstract, misdirected, and imprecise. Now, unfortunately, language that is deliberately euphemistic, abstract, misdirected, and imprecise remains a staple of political language, especially in those cases where a candidate or a party official wants to express something that does not, quote, square with the professed aim of his political party. But, on the other hand, that he believes will resonate with enough of its members to gain him some political traction. Okay, so it doesn't square with the professed aim of the political party, but nevertheless he thinks, hey, it might, get me some traction here. Now, because my most recent research has focused on the concepts of race and ethnicity, and because we are witnessing the re-election campaign of our country's first black president, my ears have been especially tuned to language that is euphemistic, misdirected, and imprecise, but that carries unmistakable racial undertones. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now. So as you probably are aware, the coded racial appeal, where you're making an appeal to voters designed to appeal to their racial sentiment without actually saying it, has been around since at least 1968 with the what they call the Southern Strategy. Now, that was a strategy where Richard Nixon lured white Southern voters away from the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party had been very, very strong in the South at that time, by using the rhetoric of states' rights and law and order. So those were what he was saying. Now, the phrase states' rights evoked for white Southern voters the key justification for the Southern hostilities leading to the American Civil War, even as it implied at that time contemporary opposition to federally mandated desegregation efforts such as the forced busing of both black and white students to districts outside their neighborhoods, and remember, for the purpose of achieving racial mixing. Similarly, Nixon's use of the phrase law and order signaled an impatience with the widespread civil unrest and the changing social mores of the era. Okay, so it was an impatience that had at its base fear and hostility to the power of the, newly mobilized Chicanos and the newly mobilized African Americans in the civil rights movement. So importantly, and this is my point, neither of those phrases, states' rights or law and order, implicitly addressed the issue of race. So this is a fairly well-known strategy that political scientists have written books about. And so I can say more about that later, but I don't want to go over my time so we can get on to discussion. So I want to bring this now to the contemporary moment and to the current campaign. So on June 28th, you'll remember, it was the day that the Supreme Court handed down a decision upholding the individual mandate for the Obama's Affordable Health Care Act. Now, that same day, the presidential candidate Mitt Romney gave a press conference in which he positioned himself with the Capitol in the background behind a podium with a sign saying, "Repeal and replace Obamacare." So to pick up on something that Scott mentioned earlier. That was the same day, you'll remember, that the House voted to hold Eric Holder in contempt of Congress for not turning over records related to that gun walking investigation that was related to Fast and Furious, where an agent got killed. Now, of course, Eric Holder is the first African-American Attorney General, and he's also the first Attorney General to have suffered the indignity of being held in contempt of Congress. And it's, thinking about those things at the time, the Obamacare and the way that Holder was held in contempt of Congress, it sort of seemed that Holder was standing in a metonymic relationship between the Congress and Obama, and that there was something going on there, in the kind of chain of associations. It struck me that the motivation behind the decision to label the act with Obama's name and then to actively and contemptuously deride the act derived from an effort to indirectly and metonymically heap racialized contempt on Obama, with the idea that a certain segment of the population would not only welcome such derision, but would warm to Romney as a result. So there's just one other instance that I will mention here. I could mention others, but this involves a time when Romney, you remember Romney went to go talk to the NAACP. And during that speech, he mentioned that he was going to repeal Obamacare, and he used that term. And he was booed at that point. Now, as it happens, it wasn't a totally bad negative reaction. And in fact, there was a standing ovation at the end of it. So it wasn't totally bad. It was just that moment. But what is more to the point is that the very next day, he went to Montana, and he spoke to an audience there. And he said to them, by the way, I had the privilege, or I guess that night, I'm sorry. By the way, I had the privilege of speaking today at the NAACP convention in Houston, and I gave them the same speech I am giving you. I don't give different speeches to different audiences, all right? I gave them the same speech. When I mentioned I'm going to get rid of Obamacare, they weren't happy. I didn't get the same response. That's okay. I want people to know what I stand for, and if I don't stand for what they want, go vote for someone else. That's just fine. But I hope people understand this. Your friends who like Obamacare, you remind them of this. If they want more stuff from the government, tell them to go vote for the other guy, more free stuff. Okay. And so what I'm hearing when I'm hearing that is a sort of indication, a sort of tapping into stereotypes of blacks as lazy, as welfare cheats, and basically as unproductive members of society, and sort of reminding people that Obama is black in that way. So what I hear when I hear these kinds of things is a sort of racialized rhetoric of contempt at work in the American political system. Now, I'm not going to suggest that it's only Republicans who do this. Democrats do this too. There are instances. However, at this moment, we have a black Democratic president, and so it's going in that direction. So this is what I hear, and I guess I wanted to bring that, and I'm interested to know what you all think.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to switch gears a bit from the American scene and discuss the topic of language and politics, and particularly how literature engages and sometimes shapes a political discourse. My interest in this topic has led me to think about the 20th century idea of totalitarianism and the ways that this idea has reemerged in the 20th century. I'm going to concentrate on a recent novel, The German Mujahid, published in 2008 by the Algerian author Boualem Sansal. In an interview titled "There Are Parallels Between Islamism and National Socialism," Sansal explains the genesis of his novel Le Village de l'Allemand, translated for the American market as The German Mujahid. Sansal recalls a trip when he happened upon a small village in Sétif that struck him as very exotic. In the next town over, he inquired about the village. Quote, "Then someone suddenly said, 'Oh, you mean the village with the German?' I was told that this was a very particular German figure, as the man was a former SS officer, an old Nazi with a dark past. I have to say this was a big shock for me. I had very romantic, idealistic notions of the Algerian War of Independence. To discover that a Nazi was involved was very disturbing." End quote. For Sansal, the mysterious German appears as an uncannily resonant symbol of the continuity between Nazism and Islamism, and of the semblance between totalitarianism in 20th century Europe and contemporary North Africa. Triangulating the memory of the Holocaust, the grisly Algerian civil war of the 1990s, and the fate of Muslims in contemporary Europe, the German Mujahid postulates radical Islam as the totalitarian threat for the 21st century, thereby joining an intense global debate about the status of the transnational jihad and perhaps Islam itself vis-a-vis Western liberal democracy. So two notable expressions of this discursive and political field are what's called the Houston Manifesto and another manifesto titled Together Facing the New Totalitarianism, both published in 2006. The first document was composed by a scholar of Marxism, by two British figures, one a scholar of Marxism, the other a political journalist, following a meeting among a group of British intellectuals concerned about radical Islam, the Iraq War, and the state of liberal left politics. So as one signer of the manifesto puts it, quote, "Evoking the traditions of the anti-fascist and anti-totalitarian democratic left, the document defends liberal democracy and Enlightenment values while denouncing anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, terrorism, and radical Islam," end quote. So to date, the manifesto has acquired over 2,800 signatures. The other manifesto features the signatures of Salman Rushdie, Bernard Henri Lévy, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and it proclaims, quote, "We, writers, journalists, intellectuals, call for resistance to religious totalitarianism and for the promotion of freedom, equal opportunity, and secular values for all," end quote. So though neoconservatives have also endorsed such views, it's worth noting that these manifestos emanate from the liberal left. But before we enter this fray, we might just pause to ask, what is totalitarianism, after all? So this term, totalitarianism or sistema totalitaria, originates in connection with Italian fascism. One of Mussolini's earliest opponents invented the term in 1923, and it referred to a foundational act of political repression, Mussolini's successful effort to alter Italy's constitution and change the nation's extant voting laws. in order to consolidate power for his regime. Yet only months later, critics of Mussolini were able to speak more expansively and presciently of a totalitarian spirit permeating European politics. Exuding total ideological commitment, the totalitarian spirit exalted collective valor against the stereotypically bourgeois traits of security, ease, spiritual emptiness, political quiescence, and so on. Now, during the post-Second World War and Cold War era, the term totalitarianism conflated Nazism and Stalinism, or fascism and communism, and came to refer more loosely to dictatorships of the far left and right. But I think totalitarianism might also be better understood as a literary rather than strictly political concept. So, for example, we might consider the following remark by George Kennan, the American diplomat and author of the 1947 essay, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, which helped to define the Cold War strategy of containment. In a 1953 symposium on totalitarianism in the modern world, Kennan said, quote, "When I try to picture totalitarianism to myself as a general phenomenon, what comes into my mind most prominently is neither the Soviet picture nor the Nazi picture as I have known them in the flesh, but rather the fictional and symbolic images created by such people as Orwell or Kafka or Arthur Koestler or the early Soviet satirists. The purest expression of the phenomenon, in other words, seems to me to have been rendered not in its physical reality, but in its power as a dream or a nightmare. Not that it lacks the physical reality or that this reality is lacking in power, but it is precisely in the way it appears to people, in the impact it has on the subconscious, in the state of mind it creates in its victims, that totalitarianism reveals most deeply its meaning and nature." End quote. Now, Kennan doesn't speculate about why the work of these particular authors so forcefully embodies the totalitarian imaginary, but his stress on the nightmare switches the emphasis from the state to literature, right, to literature's vulnerable everyman, to those portrayals, or to those people reduced to bare life, and others to what the poet Czesław Miłosz calls the captive mind. So on this view, literature, the realm of the symbolic, the imagination, becomes the site for understanding totalitarianism as history, rather than the reverse procedure, namely using history to interpret literature. Now, with this backdrop in mind, I'd like to return to the German Mujahid. The novel is narrated through the alternating journal entries of two brothers, Rachel and Malrich, who live in a banlieue or suburb of Paris during the mid-1990s. Born to an Algerian mother and a German father who reside in a small village in Algeria, the brothers were sent during childhood to live in France, where the elder brother excels academically, whereas the younger brother gravitates to the street life. Now, during the course of Algeria's civil war of the 1990s, the parents are murdered, their throats slit by soldiers from the armed Islamic group. Now, this revelation sends the elder brother, Rachel, back to Algeria, where he discovers that his father, Hans Schiller, had been a prominent Nazi. The father, Rachel learns, was a chemical engineer educated at the University of Frankfurt and later employed in Auschwitz and Buchenau. Now, the text suggests their father, trained as a chemical engineer, might have been involved in the development of Zyklon B, the poison used in the gas chambers, which provokes Rachel to wonder if his father participated in the, quote, endless arguments that the proposal to gas camp prisoners had triggered among the dignitaries, the intellectuals, and the bleeding hearts of the Third Reich, end quote. After a visit to Auschwitz, Rachel seeks to atone for the sins of his father, committing suicide by gas. Meanwhile, the younger brother, Malrich, tries to come to grips with the changing landscape of his own estate or neighborhood, which over the years has witnessed the increasing influence of local radical imams. In this portrayal in particular, the novel appears as one that many on both sides of the Atlantic and across the ideological spectrum have been waiting for. In other words, a voice from within the Muslim world that acknowledges and legitimates anxieties about jihadist infiltration into the West. Now, the younger brother, Malrich, himself had flirted with the world of jihadism in his youth, but grew out of this attraction in young adulthood as he dabbles in the secular world of petty crime. But when he learns about the murder of Nadia, a 16-year-old Arab girl, by a local personage nicknamed Allah's Terminator, he and his mates conspire to not to exact revenge on the perpetrator, but more ambitiously to assassinate the local imam, who supports the murderer and has organized his legal defense. And it's in this description of the defense that of Allah's Terminator that the novel is most convincing. Quote, "The Terminator's lawyer, some guy with a beard and a three-piece suit, knew how to play the system. He got to faxing and phoning every association, every Islamic consulate, every brotherhood, every marabout, and every sleeper network. Even woke up the Minister of the Interior. The sky was black with fax toner and thundering with righteous anger." End quote. Now, via any number of narrative contrivances, the text ensures that the moral is not lost on any reader. Jihadism is indeed the 21st century totalitarianism, its umbilical connection to Nazism confirmed by history and recent and current events. A narrative symmetry exists between this idea and the view that the Muslim world is slow to catch on to the meaning of the Holocaust. Young people in the Arab world know almost nothing about National Socialism and the Holocaust, the author Boualem Sansal said in an interview. So when Malrich enlightens his group of friends on the historical roots of jihadism, he begins with a lecture, after all, on Hitler. His friends listen earnestly and innocently, as if hearing of National Socialism and the Holocaust for the very first time. There's also an insinuation that what they've heard previously is only a falsification, a conjury of Holocaust denials. The radical imam's reach is extensive indeed. But in the ethical, historical universe of the novel, this monologue is necessary to provide a discursive platform for the younger brother's evolving moral education. Textual penance for an imagined deficit in the moral education of young or Arab youth culture. Marketed in the United States as, quote, the first Arab novel to confront the Holocaust, the German Mujahid translates the inner world of jihadism for a readership increasingly disposed to view this movement as a new incarnation of totalitarianism on the global stage. But we might regard this moral with skepticism. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, writes the historian Anson Robbenbach, quote, "and the debate over the American war in Iraq revived talk of totalitarianism among liberals and leftists thinking about radical Islamists and Middle Eastern dictatorships. The return of this term is instructive because its history is not at all as luminescent as its advocates would have us believe," end quote. And I agree with Robbenbach that its history and its meaning are far from luminescent. The German Mujahid is a rich and fascinating novel, but its entrance into this discursive field raises serious questions. In the last century, the discourse of totalitarianism functioned to buttress support for the war effort, but also to foment anxieties about anti-communism. Finally, if there is any continuity between jihadist and totalitarian movements, and I'm not sure that there is, we might also remember the catastrophic history of the 20th century and the ways in which the language of totalitarianism describes but can also exacerbate the threat of total war. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of our speakers. Very different views. I think it's going to stick with me for a long time, this idea that the purest manifestation of these ideas is in literature more than in reality, and the implications of that for those of us who are writers, and how carefully we must choose our words. And thinking, though, of the practical and thinking of the current political landscape, I do want to get into several things that people talked about or alluded to. First of all, when these thoughts are out there, there is an effort, and I don't think I'm being too cynical here, a very deliberate effort to introduce these phrases and this discourse into the conversation. I want to talk about who is responsible for that, and how deliberate and planned is it. And I think about terms that we hear recently, especially with regard to the Tea Party, where they talk about bringing our country back. And when I hear that expression, I immediately think of it as having a real racial subtext to it. Bring it back what? From away from the black man being in power? Is that what's being said? And how does something like that become the talking point for thousands of people and pundits, etc.? Do you want to start on that?
Okay, wow. That's a big question. I guess I would say yes. What I was struck by in listening to the ideas across our presentations and picking up on what you're saying, you put a phrase out there and there's a giant elephant that everyone is supposed to conjure or understand to exist just to the side of it. And Paula, you used the phrase chain of associations to talk about how that works in explicitly political contexts. I say this, you fill in that, it lets us both exist in this, yet other space that enables people to sort of abdicate responsibility for where that chain can end up going, while at the same time capitalizing upon it. That chains of associations function to invoke and disavow simultaneously, so that we're participating in two conversations at once. And that for me was something that was very striking, and thinking about, a play called Race that, puts a set of rules out there that the rest of the play then goes on to disavow or reject, fail to conform to. Thinking about the way the Romney campaign is unfolding in the present moment and the way that it's being taken up, the types of, we talked, in a prior conversation about the 47% moment, and I said it didn't sound the right way. Actually, no, I didn't mean it. It was wrong. The latest version of that, the shame spiral. And then also thinking, Vaughn, about your reference to, triangulated relationships between Holocaust, Algerian Civil War, the plight of Muslims in contemporary Europe, and the ways that people are meant to hold multiple things simultaneously in their minds in order to participate in whatever the political project is, the desire to influence, the desire to exert a certain type of affective or other force in order to get people to buy into a set of values or to engage in certain types of behaviors in terms of voting or otherwise. For me, that is really striking. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but.
Well, I certainly think it gets us part of the way there. I think one of the things that strikes me about hearing the conversation tonight is that it seems like many of this comes from the right, or more often it comes from the right rather than the left. Is that really true, or is it that the right has just simply been better at it and more effective at it and has better people working on this?
Well, I think so. I know that the right has had some very, very smart political operatives, and have some incredibly strong organizations that allow for instance, talking points memo. I think that everybody recognizes the sort of political genius of Karl Rove and he has never been in elective office. You know, he may have at one point had a sort of official position, but that's not his power. His power is in the ability to draw connections among people, and I think with, for instance, these prayer breakfasts, and to put forth a set of talking points. And the thing is there's a real power in having talking points that you say, over, and where you have everybody on, a number of different people on different shows saying the same things. That's getting your message out, I don't think the Democratic Party or people on the left in general have been as successful at that. I haven't seen, maybe it's part of the character of people who affiliate with the left, that they want to go their own way. I'm not sure, but I haven't seen that successful an organization. So I just wanted to say something else when I was thinking about what Brandy was saying about this chain of associations, when I was talking about this rhetoric of contempt that works through associations or through metonymy of one link hanging to another. And I had put out a blog where I was asking about this, and somebody wrote back to me, and he says, unlike a rhetoric of persuasion, a rhetoric of contempt is designed to be unanswerable, to make its targets look weak if they try to argue back. Because the minute you say, oh, you're invoking race when you say this, someone can say, no, I'm not. You're just making that up. That's in your head. So there is one thing that I will read to you. This is actually a kind of gem, I think, in terms of helping to explore this issue, expose this issue. So there's a book by Alexander Lamas, who's a political scientist. The book is called Southern Politics, and he'd first written about this in an earlier book, but he hadn't named the person that had given the interview. Okay, so he had a 1981 interview. The person that he was interviewing was Lee Atwater, who was at one point the Republican Party chairman. And Atwater had acknowledged the point of the strategy was to reach the white racist Southern voter without alienating other U.S. Americans who might be offended by that explicit racism. So Atwater in the interview says, as to the whole Southern strategy that Harry Dent and others put together in 1968, opposition to the Voting Rights Act would have been a central part of keeping the South. You start out in 1954 saying, nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. So to actually have someone admit that that's what they're doing is kind of amazing, because this is exactly what doesn't get talked about in polite conversation. So I think one of the important things that we have to do is to talk about it in polite conversation, to really expose how this works, so that we can, obviously some people will be drawn to that, and that's part of what the decision making that they'll go through. But to sort of keep it under, it's ridiculous to poor Bob Costas when he acknowledges that Gabby Douglas is African American. Like, who didn't notice? We are not that kind of society. We notice these things. We may have all kinds of opinions about that. Many of us will be glad, but we do notice. This is sort of. I don't know if you have anything you want to add at this point.
Well, I'll just add quickly that in contrast to the language of contempt or even race in the U.S. context, the language of totalitarianism spans the ideological spectrum. And so these recent initiatives that I described that are kind of rehabilitating the language of totalitarianism have actually emanated from left circles or left liberal circles, and they also, I think, cross-pollinate with neoconservative or more conservative circles as well. So this renewed language of totalitarianism, I think, is being mobilized, from the right to the left, and so I wonder how useful that distinction is in this particular context, at least. So.
Yes, and I do want to, emphasize again that using the coded racial appeal is not something that only Republicans have done. Basically, the point that I want to make is that it is a resource. Okay, it may be a resource that I find, damnable, but it is a resource. Race is a resource in that sense, and people do use it when they find it useful. So.
One of the questions that I had to do with, again, this probably it's more towards the conservative side, but the actual words liberal and conservative, which used to mean something. I mean, the word liberal is almost a pejorative in some sense of the word, and certainly there's people in this room who remember the days of John F. Kennedy when that certainly was not the case. But David Brooks in the New York Times recently had a piece about the word conservative and how he thinks it's actually been stolen maybe by a bunch of nuts, and it means something completely different from how it set out to be. Any thoughts on that? Some of the basic words and how we describe ourselves politically don't mean what they meant just that short time ago.
Do you have something to say about that?
Not really, no. I do have the mic. I will note though that George McGovern wrote an essay a few years ago. I want to say in Harper's, possibly the Atlantic Monthly, in which he defends liberalism against its detractors, and he also notes that people don't want to claim liberalism even anymore. They'll describe themselves as progressives or radical Democrats or anything but liberalism. And even though, if forced to articulate their views, they tend to, jive pretty well with traditional liberal views. And so that gives him the occasion to sort of, defend those views against the kind of caricature of liberalism that maybe we've seen. I wonder if there's a parallel in quite the same way with conservatism. I'm not sure.
Well, do we? Well, that's interesting because so you're basically saying that there may be an effort to reclaim that word, possibly get it out of where it's been placed. Talk about that a little bit, about reclaiming words that have gone in a different direction. I mean, I think one example, of course, is the word queer, and in the gay world, there's an effort to take that from being a pejorative and claiming it as almost like a call to arms. But I'm not sure that it has completely worked.
I'm not going to talk about queer, but I'll talk about Obamacare because I think that's one of the words that is being reclaimed in a sense. So, initially, of course, when it came out, I think that it was intended to work as an epithet, right? And then, in fact, I was Googling around and saw that the congressional Democrats actually prevented the Republicans from entering that term into the record. So they stood in their way. They didn't want them to call it. They made them call it the Affordable Health Care Act. But more recently, we have seen a reclaiming of the term. We see supporters of Obama standing up. We love Obamacare. I think maybe the campaign may even be selling, I love Obamacare buttons. And Obama is on record of having said, well, I don't care if they call it Obamacare. I'm glad for people to think that I care, right? So I think it reminds me of something that Audre Lorde said, who is a wonderful black lesbian poet and essayist, where she's got a lot of writing about language and power. And she says, nothing you claim can be used against you. And we can see the reclaiming of terms. Certainly the civil rights era was a time when the term black, which was not seen as a positive term, was reclaimed. So black power, black is beautiful. The term Chicano, which was a term that was used to deride people of Mexican ancestry, was reclaimed, and people claimed to be Chicano. The word queer, certainly, which was always an epithet, has been reclaimed. And maybe, what? Oh, feminist. Oh, yes. Well, feminist. It's so funny. I've got all these feminist students, but they do not call themselves feminists, right? But, Yeah, but so these words, they come in and out. But I think that there's been a little bit of an emphasis on reclaiming Obamacare to say no, it's okay, and really there's no other way to do it. What are you going to do? It's what everybody's calling it now, so you might as well say that it's a positive thing.
I would just add that I think the ability to reclaim, trying to have the conversation about when that happens, how it happens, is fundamentally about power. It's one of the places where we see this intersection of language and power, because I think the effort to redefine, to recuperate, to claim, what is the position from which you attempt to do that? What is the audience with whom and for whom you make those efforts? In one of our conversations, we did discuss queer and the fact that within the academy, that term has absolute, value and respect within humanities discourse. However, that may not translate outside of the academy. People with a certain level of educational attainment and a certain social circle can use that term in a way that is understood to have a certain positive association, a certain critical, progressive, liberal consciousness associated with it, where that would not in any way translate into other circumstances, where you would still understand there to be some derision. And I think that there's always that undercurrent that exists, that double speak that exists even with terms that people attempt to recuperate. And then I think there's also an issue of history, because certainly within African American cultural politics, the N-word, people who have lived long lives and dealt with its most hateful and violent use aren't yet ready to say, well, if we use it, we're taking the sting out of it, because doing so is still wrapped up in a set of power relations that tends to disadvantage a certain group of people.
No, there's a wonderful essay by Gloria Naylor, which you're probably aware of, that's called Mommy, What Does Nigger Mean? Which is a really terrific essay that explores the politics of that word. So she's a prominent African-American artist, author, who's written a number of wonderful books.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.